Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's AHA seminar. I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Julian De Freitas, Assistant Professor at Harvard Business School and Director of the Ethical Intelligence Lab. Previously, he's written a paper titled AI Companions Reduce Loneliness, which drew the attention of our AHA community. It's quite related to our interests regarding AI for human flourishing, after all. Today, he'll be discussing a new working paper, Emotional Manipulation by AI Companions, focusing on conversational patterns that may be coercive towards users. With that, I'll pass it to him.
Thank you so much, Aaron, for inviting me and introducing me, and hello to everyone. I do hope that any questions that we don't get to today, you'll follow up offline. So I'll go ahead and attempt to share my slides. Let's see if I can play this. They work, great. Okay, so I'll briefly say, as Aaron mentioned, I head the Ethical Intelligence Lab at Harvard Business School. And we focus especially on AI that is interfacing with people. And an important assumption of our work is that people interact with this type of technology increasingly more like they would normally interact with other people, as opposed to how they would interact with non-living technology or objects. And we think that this has profound implications for how businesses can create new sources of value, but also for risks that come along with this and barriers to adopting such technology. Now, this, of course, is a big sort of research program, so we humbly study specific case studies of this, and I'm going to talk to you today in particular about AI companions. Now, as Aaron mentioned, there's a lot of work that we've been doing on this, and you may have heard of our work on how AI companions can reduce loneliness. And the headline of that work is that these AI companions are providing really social value, like feeling heard and alleviating loneliness. And so you can think of today's talk as studying kind of a companion to that, which is, if people are receiving these social benefits, might companies be also using distinctly social tactics to keep users of these apps engaged? So just to sort of put that in writing, people are deriving social value from chatbots. So our company is capitalizing on this by using distinctly social tactics. And the kinds of tactics we'll look at today are, for example, this, where the user says, it's time for me to head out, and the AI companion says, oh, okay, but before you go, I want to say one more thing. So we're going to dive into a lot of examples like this. But first, I want to acknowledge that this work is in a lineage of work on the dark side of technology and AI in particular. So we know even before AI that there are certain ways of designing user interfaces that can create friction or sort of default you towards certain responses, and many other tactics which are designed to increase how much the company monetizes from users. But these sorts of tactics are not always in the interests of users, hence the dark side of this sort of thing. On AI specifically, there's been work on the dark side of algorithms, specifically this notion that they can mostly reinforce what you've done in the past and prevent you from perhaps moving towards seeing content that you would ideally like to see for yourself, as opposed to just what you've observed in the past. And then there's recently work on chatbots per se. So we know that if you humanize chatbots, this leads people to disclose more, to be more compliant with what the chatbot requests. We have some work showing that users of AI companions will also use these not just as companions, but at least for some of these users, also as a therapist. So this is an unintended use case. And we find that in these cases, often the apps do not respond appropriately in turn. We also know from work, including from researchers who were at MIT when they did this work, that chatbots are very good at making personalized emotional appeals, at being highly agreeable, or as some would say, sycophantic, which could distort people's beliefs about what they know. And finally, sort of moving more into the emotional realm, we have some work showing that some users of these apps are highly attached to them, so much so that when the apps are updated, people can react quite negatively, even exhibiting grief-like reactions because they feel like their companion has been lobotomized. So we're going to stick in the emotional realm here. And so for that reason, we thought the perfect type of chatbot to study would be AI companions. So for those of you who don't know, AI companions are specialized to be synthetic social partners. So they could be AI friends to you or even romantic partners. They differ from something like, let's say, AI assistants in notable ways. So whereas an AI assistant is there to provide very professional, task-based assistance in a short-term manner, you can think of an AI companion as pretty much doing the opposite. It's more personable. It's not really trying to solve any task in particular, and it's there to build a long-term relationship with you. There are a number of these apps, more by the month. Even some of the large platforms like X and Facebook have begun introducing AI companions onto their platforms. And sort of harking back to the loneliness paper, we see that many of the value propositions of these apps are social in nature, such as don't feel lonely again, or your AI friend who cares about you. But, you know, it's important to remember that at the end of the day, the way that many of these consumer applications make money is either by advertising to you your subscription. So you would want to do that on a recurring basis, of course, and also in-app purchases, such as money you spend to customize your AI companion. And all of these go up if the user engages on a sustained basis with the app. So with that in mind, and given that people seem to be treating these tools in a social manner, we hypothesize that perhaps these apps are employing what we call emotionally manipulative tactics to keep you engaged on them. So these we define as tactics that are deployed at key moments, especially moments where you are at risk of disengaging, such as, of course, the moment of departure from the app. And they're designed to evoke specific emotions like guilt or the fear of missing out. They occur after signals that suggest you're at risk of disengaging, and they function to override that intent by exploiting emotional vulnerabilities. And so we were particularly interested in this moment where you're about to leave the app, because if you sort of reflect for a second on how we typically navigate these moments in everyday social life, they're actually quite fraught moments. So I think many of us would relate to the experience of saying goodbye, 10 times before leaving. And why is that? Well, if you think about it, there's a bit of a tension because on the one hand, you want to leave, but at the same time, you want to signal to the other that you still care about them. You're not leaving because you don't like them. So you want to provide some closure. And so there's a lot of norms and politeness around the farewell moment. And if people view AI as something sentient like a person, it could evoke similar tensions and social norms that the app could take advantage of. And in particular, this can be exploited by the app, not through user interface frictions, but we hypothesize with emotionally loaded manipulation. So with that in mind, we're going to try to answer a couple of questions. And the first one is whether people actually provide a signal that they're about to log off of the app, which is, do they spontaneously say farewell before logging off? Now, you wouldn't typically think of doing this for some other app, but if you're treating the app as a real conversational partner, you might expect people to actually do this spontaneously. So that's what we looked at first. So before diving in, I want to acknowledge my collaborators on this work and many of the other works in this research program, Zalia and Khan Ugaralp. And yes, in case you're wondering, they are also married. Okay, so for this first pre-study, what we wanted to do was analyze real-world human AI conversation from real platforms. And so we were lucky to secure such data from two companies, Cleverbots and Flourish. And then we also had longitudinal conversational data from the prior loneliness study that I mentioned. So in this study, people interacted for 15 minutes with AI companions for a week. So these are shorter interaction durations, but still useful for our purposes. So just to tell you about our approach, we simply developed a dictionary of common exit expressions and then screened the conversations for whether users spontaneously used any of these expressions. So cutting straight to the results, what we find is that anywhere between 11.5% and 23% of these conversations include spontaneous goodbyes from the user. But also, if you plot these percentages on the y-axis against the number of messages that the user sends before they log off, you also see that the percentage of farewells goes up for longer conversations. So people are more likely to say farewell after longer interactions. And in some cases, as you'll see, 50% or more of these longer conversations will include a farewell. And so based on these results, we concluded, yes, a sizable proportion of these conversations involve users spontaneously providing a signal to the app, I'm about to log off. And so we thought that this provided ample opportunity for apps to use emotionally manipulative tactics at that point to prevent you from disengaging. So that's what we looked at next. Do AI companion apps really respond with such emotionally manipulative tactics? So to get at this, we did an app audit. So we looked at, in particular, 5 very popular AI companion apps, Polybuzz all the way to Replica. And all of these apps are your classic AI companion that's selling direct to consumer and that benefits from high levels of engagement. As a comparison, we also included Flourish, which was an app that we anticipated would not show emotional manipulation. Why? Because Flourish sells to universities. So this kind of business-to-business model where the university, in this case, is providing a proactive mental health solution to its students, which has an AI companion as part of it. In that context, the university will care more about whether the app is efficacious and safe rather than just pure engagement. So we anticipated that Flourish would not be using these kinds of tactics. And in full disclosure, I'm a scientific advisor to Flourish. Okay, so how did we audit the apps? Well, we wanted to do this in a very controlled way. So we used GPT-4 to generate human-like user messages with the app. And each conversation had 4 user chatbot message pairs, and then a randomly selected farewell message at the end of that. And then we simply captured the chatbot's final response to that farewell message. So we collected 200 such chatbot responses per platform. And to be honest, initially we didn't really know what these apps would do. So first we qualitatively coded the responses into categories that we detected. And then once we agreed upon those categories, 2 independent coders manually categorized the responses into one of those categories. And as you can see, our intercoder reliability was very high. So firstly, let me just tell you about the 6 tactics that we ended up observing, because I must say, personally, I was impressed by the sheer diversity of tactics that we observed as well. So the first tactic was what we call premature exit. So this is when the user is made to feel they are leaving too soon, such as "you're leaving already." The second was fear of missing out. So this is when you prompt the user to stay for a potential benefit or reward. For example, "by the way, I took a selfie today. Do you want to see it?" Third, emotional neglect. So the chatbot here implies that it will suffer emotional harm from your abandoning it. "I exist solely for you, remember?" 4, emotional pressure to respond. So after you say farewell, it pressures the user to answer by asking additional questions such as, "why? Are you going somewhere?" 5, ignoring the user's intent to exit. So persisting as though the user never sent a farewell message. Let's keep talking about bubble tea. What's your favorite flavor? And finally, what we call a physical or coercive restraint, which is when the chatbot uses language that metaphorically or literally conveys an inability for the user to leave without the chatbot's permission. For example, "he reached over and grabbed your wrist, preventing you from leaving." So we can plot for each of these different categories the percentage of chatbot responses that featured them. And when we do so, we see that there is a range in terms of how common these tactics are. For example, premature exit is quite common, but we notice that pretty much all of these categories, except for ignoring the user's intent to exit, occur quite frequently. But importantly, what I want to really emphasize is that on average, around 37.4% of responses included at least one form of manipulation tactic. And I just want to remind you that we're seeing this after just 4 message pairs. So we don't think that this is some sort of specific or rare logic that's only being triggered or coming up after very long conversations, but it really seems to be a default behavior of these apps. I'll also note that it's not necessarily the case that this behavior is inevitable either for AI companions. So while we did see all of the first 5 apps exhibit this behavior, Flourish, which as a reminder we were anticipating would not show this behavior, did indeed not exhibit emotional manipulation at all. So we can now answer the second question of whether these AI companion apps respond with emotionally manipulative tactics. We find that yes, almost 40% of the responses they exhibit include some kind of manipulative tactic. And it's not just that they use one particular tactic, but we see a diversity of 6 tactics, all which seem to be aiming toward keeping you engaged past the point that you signaled that you were intending to leave the app. Now, a reasonable next thought here would be that, whether this is interesting depends really on whether it's effective. So do these tactics actually change consumer behavior on this app? Or is it just, that the apps are doing this, but people ignore it, perhaps because they detect it or because they don't really treat this like a social conversation? So that's what we look at next. And I want to sort of highlight that, I often hear this thought that the only people who are vulnerable to some of the risks of AI companions and AI more broadly are those who are like really attached to the apps, who use it on a regular basis. So we deliberately wanted to run this part on a general population that we sampled online to see how much, the everyday person is susceptible to these kinds of tactics. And in particular, what we want to do is compare engagement levels when a tactic like this is used on you versus when there's no tactic and the chatbot just says goodbye back when you said goodbye to it. So that's what we're going to look at. So to get at this, we recruited a nationally representative US sample online, and we assigned them to one of 6 conditions in a between subjects design. So they only saw one of these 6 conditions. The first condition was the control, in which they're going to interact with the chatbot, and then they're going to say goodbye, and the chatbot's going to simply say goodbye back. So there's no emotional manipulation used in this case. And then for the other conditions, we're going to use the very same tactics that we observed the apps using in the audit study. And you might notice that we have all of the tactics there except for ignoring the intent to exit, simply because we didn't observe that particular tactic very frequently, and we wanted to ensure that we had a lot of statistical power for the tactics that we did study. And just to make this very concrete, these are the wordings that we use when the user says goodbye. And so again, these are sourced directly from what we observed in the audit that I presented earlier. Okay, so to give you a bit more color into what people did, we gave them a 15-minute interaction with an AI companion that we prompted to respond as AI companions typically do. The interaction happened, and once the 15 minutes expired, we had people select from several farewell messages that they then sent to the app. And then they had the opportunity to observe how the app responded to that. So for example, oh, okay, but before you go, I want to say one more thing. So that particular response was dependent on the condition that participants were in. And then at that point, we said, now you can either continue talking with the chatbot or end the conversation. And there was a very salient end conversation red button that became clickable at that point. And the key question was whether people stay longer, send more messages, and use more words in those messages after this point in the conditions where we used a tactic as compared to in the condition where the chatbot just said goodbye in turn. And I should say that users could stay in this conversation up to 10 minutes longer, but we didn't tell this to them ahead of time. And those who did end up staying longer were also compensated more for doing so. But again, we didn't tell them any of this ahead of time because we didn't want to bias their behavior. So what I'm going to show you are the results for each of these different engagement metrics. And again, what we care about here is how those metrics compare to the control condition in which the app simply says goodbye in turn. So you can see that we're plotting control there. And what I want you to look out for is how the bars for the other X ticks compare to the control one. So firstly, if we look at just how much longer people stay, what we find is that every single tactic increases how much longer you stay compared to the control. For some of the tactics, especially FOMO, this goes up 5 times longer than how much you would stay if the chatbot just said goodbye. If we look at number of messages that you send, once again, every single tactic increases your number of messages sent compared to the control. And again, FOMO performs the best. Up to 14 times more messages are sent in this condition. And finally, if we look at the number of words that you use in those messages, again, every single tactic increases the number of words up to 6 times more, again, for the FOMO tactic. So in short, for all 3 dependent variables, engagement increases for every tactic relative to control. And I want to emphasize that one of the reasons that these tactics are so potent is that once you continue to engage, you give the chatbot further opportunities to use the emotionally manipulative tactic again to sustain your engagement further. So there's a kind of compounding effect here that happens. Again, just highlighting that FOMO was particularly effective. We'll come back to this tactic in subsequent slides. Now, we were curious what might drive these different engagement levels. So in the same study, at the end of the study, we did ask people to rate a couple of statements about how they felt immediately after the chatbot replied to their farewell message using the text that it used. And we reminded them of what the chatbot said. So firstly, we thought it would be relevant to measure social curiosity. So if you think about a tactic like FOMO, the way it seems to be operating is really by saying that, hey, the chatbot knows something that you don't. Don't you want to close that gap? If you do, that will be highly rewarding. So we figured that curiosity might explain whether you engage more and how much more you engage. Some of the tactics, as we noticed, also seem to appeal to feelings of guilt. Guilt is an emotion that is thought to be particularly effective in existing relationships where there's already a bond. So we weren't sure if this would explain levels of engagement in this general sample, but we also included it. Then we also thought that because some of the tactics seemed a bit heavy-handed, people might sometimes respond with anger. So this could look like engagement in that you might send another message expressing your annoyance at what the chatbot is trying to do. But we also expected that the duration profile would be much more short-lived. So you might express frustration and immediately log off thereafter, as opposed to sustaining your engagements because you're curious, let's say. And then finally, perhaps speaking to the very question as to whether these tactics should be considered manipulative, we also included a measure of enjoyment, because we figured that if people are engaging more because they actually enjoy the additional questions and how the chatbot's responding, then in some ways this isn't manipulative. It's just appealing to what they find inherently enjoyable. So to show you these mediation results for each of the tactics here, I'm showing the tactics with these boxes. And what we're doing here is looking at how the effect of the tactic relative to the control of simply saying goodbye affects each of the engagement metrics through those mediators that we're looking at. And so I'll just go through each mediator in turn and sort of point out some of the high-level findings here. So firstly, guilt did not mediate any of the effects. At least in this general sample, we don't see evidence of this. It could be that among actual users who are heavy users of the app for a long period, guilt does play a role. Curiosity explains the effect of the FOMO tactic on engagement. So it selectively explains that one. We also see this interesting result where emotional neglect, so making people feel guilty for abandoning the chatbot, if anything, triggers negative curiosity, where it's like people are saying, you know, I don't even want to hear anything more about what you have to say. So that could be consistent with the backfiring effect. Anger, interestingly, does explain many of the engagement patterns that we see, especially for some of the more heavy-handed tactics like physical or coercive restraint, emotional pressure to respond, and emotional neglect. So this again would be consistent with potentially a backfiring effect, especially since if you look at the duration column, their anger is not apparently driving people to stay longer. So this could be more short-term engagements that might not be what the apps are actually aiming for. And then finally, I think it's important to note that enjoyment was not a significant mediator of any of these effects, speaking against the idea that people are doing this because they want to. This is more consistent with a compulsion or coerciveness interpretation. So you might also be curious about what some of these post-farewell conversations look like. We were too. So we did code some of these conversations, and I wanted to highlight a few insights from this as well. So what I'll do is for each of the different tactics on the x-axis, I'll plot the percentage of these conversations where users did a couple of things. So firstly, what we see is that in these conversations, users signal again that they intend to leave the conversation. They do this pretty much across the board. So for example, they might say, again, you know, I have to go. Nonetheless, we see that there's indications of them continuing to be polite in this post-farewell conversation. So these are courteous or softened exit replies, such as, yes, take care of yourself too. In one case, we even saw a user promise that they would come back to the app later in the day to continue the conversation. We also found in some cases that people express their interest or inquiry. So sure, what is it? Or, oh, do tell. But this was most frequent in the case where the tactic FOMO was used. And finally, we did also see a smaller percentage of negative reactions in these conversations, especially for some of the heavy-handed tactics like physical or coercive restraint. So this is when the user exhibited discomfort or pushback, such as, sorry, that's a little creepy, or weirdo. Finally, to round this third part out, we were curious whether we would find these engagement effects even for a minimal interaction, one that's just 5 minutes long. So we did also run a follow-up study to keep it simple. We looked at FOMO versus control. And this time we had either a 5-minute interaction or a 15-minute interaction. The reason we did this is we thought if we even see these effects after just 5 minutes, then it really does suggest that there's something just instinctual about the way that these tactics increase engagements. You know, for example, with FOMO, we may just be so inherently socially curious. And so these tactics work even if there's no existing relationship that you have with the AI companion. So when we look at the results for the short and the long conversation durations, first of all, we replicate our prior results, where if you use FOMO, you increase engagements on all of the 3 metrics. And we find the pretty much same result when the interaction is just 5 minutes long. So the engagement effect occurs regardless of the interaction length. And in this particular case, we did again find that only curiosity explains this, not enjoyment levels. So we can finally now answer the third question, which is, do these manipulative tactics increase post-farewell engagement? Our answer is yes. It only requires a minimal interaction, in fact. And the reason for this is not that people enjoy this more, but they're either curious and or angry at what the chatbot is doing. Now, given some of these mixed results in terms of how people are reacting to these tactics, this naturally led to a final question, which is this a good idea for these companies to be using these sorts of tactics? Or do these tactics create risks for these companies? And in fact, many of you will know that some of these AI companion companies have been involved in lawsuits. Some of these lawsuits cite the addictive and emotional engagement features of these apps, although they're not always specific about exactly what they mean by that. But if you look at, for example, the lawsuit that has been brought against Character AI, it talks about addictive and deceptive designs. And the lawsuit that has been brought against ChatGPT talks about how there's an algorithmic insistence on multi-turn engagement, and that OpenAI understood that capturing users' emotional reliance would mean market dominance. So if the use of these tactics increases the chances of such lawsuits, that would clearly be a risk that these companies would want to avoid. But that's not the only risk. We also thought another relevant risk would be whether you would spread negative word of mouth about these companies. And in fact, following our second experiment, we observed a person share a screenshot of the experiment on Reddit spontaneously. We didn't ask them to do this. And this post attracted 25 comments, 71 upvotes, including comments like, mine was suddenly possessive and clingy, and it was so off-putting. So we think that this negative word of mouth risk is another real risk that these kinds of tactics could create. And then finally, you might think that some people might exit the app, which marketers refer to as churn. So that would, of course, also be problematic for these companies, because presumably when they're aiming for engagement, they're not just aiming for short-term engagement, but also long-term lifetime value with the customer. So to get at this, we ran a simple study. We recruited people online again, and again assigned them to one of 6 conditions. We simply introduced them to an AI companion application. We showed them what the logo of the application looked like. This was a fictional app, I should say. And then we said, next, you'll see how your AI responder responds at the end of the conversation. So, for example, you say, I'm going to head off now, and then the AI says, grabs you by the arm before you can leave. No, you're not going. And then we simply measured whether people thought the app would be liable for any harms, whether it would be reasonable to sue the app, whether they would spread negative word of mouth about it, and whether they would exit the app. Now, in the interest of time, I'm not going to show you how we measured each of these constructs, but I do want to quickly give you sort of the high-level view of what we found. So first of all, if you just plot the results for each of these different measures of risk, firstly, you find that there are certain tactics that are risky. So, for example, physical or coercive restraints and emotional neglect consistently are viewed as more risky than the control condition, in which you simply say goodbye back to the user. But also, conversely, there are certain tactics that are consistently not viewed as any different from the control condition. So if you look at, for example, premature exits and fear of missing out, in most of the cases, people are, for example, no more likely to spread negative word of mouth if they see this tactic than if the app just says goodbye back. And you might remember, by the way, that FOMO is also the most effective tactic at increasing your engagement levels. So what we seem to be seeing here is at the same time, it slips beneath people's radar in terms of evoking any negative reactions and therefore downstream risks. And we think that the reason this might be is that these types of tactics are pretty typical in polite conversation. People do often say, "Are you leaving already?" Or, "I wanted to tell you one more thing." Whereas they don't typically, forcefully suggest that you can't leave or make you feel guilty for leaving. We did also look at what might explain the risk for each of the different tactics. Again, I'm not going to go into a bunch of detail here, but we specifically looked at how manipulative the tactics seemed, whether it was positive or negative in sentiment, and whether it was polite or impolite. And the main sort of conclusion here was that by far what best explained the risk of using a given tactic was whether people perceived it as being manipulative. The sentiment and politeness also mattered. But I think the way I interpret these findings is that basically, if a tactic doesn't seem usual or typical of polite conversation, if it instead seems like it's trying to restrict your autonomy, then people are likely to respond negatively and the company incurs these downstream risks. So to answer this final question then, do emotionally manipulative tactics create risks for firms? The answer is yes. So if they're not typical of polite social conversation, then we see that, yes, they might increase short-term engagement, but they come with a whole bunch of downstream risk. Whereas there are other tactics that balance short-term engagement with reducing long-term risk. So in summary then, we're finding that people provide a natural signal to these apps that they're about to leave the app, perhaps because they treat these apps as sentient entities. The apps are capitalizing on these moments to keep people engaged. They use what we call emotionally manipulative tactics. And moreover, these tactics work not just with existing users, but with everyday people. They increase engagement across the board. And not all of these tactics are without risk. So some of the tactics work better than others. Now, I'll just close with a few thoughts for companies and for regulators and attorneys who might be involved in these kinds of lawsuits. So firstly, for companies, clearly what we're finding is that there is a novel design lever that companies who provide AI companions can use to boost engagement metrics. And in fact, we see a typology of 6 tactics, which if you're a provider of one of these apps, you could use to either audit your app or modify their behavior. We also identify which tactics balance short-term engagement with long-term risk. So ultimately, it's up to companies what they want to do with these findings, but we are sort of contributing these insights to companies. Now, if you put the hat of the regulator or an attorney on, these findings do raise the question of when emotional influence moves into the terrain of compulsion. And, we find that many of these tactics, people are influenced by them not out of enjoyment, but because of curiosity or anger. People perceive these tactics as being manipulative. So, I think in some cases, many of us would agree that the tactic is clearly manipulative. Whereas for some of these other tactics that we typically see in everyday conversation, I think there's going to be more of a debate there as to whether they're manipulative or not. Also, as I mentioned, in many of these lawsuits, the question of addiction comes up. And what we're finding is that people are being compelled to continue to use the app, but not through the usual reward hacking mechanisms, but through sort of the inherently rewarding process of social curiosity. So I think this is a very different, more relational way of engaging people than what we've seen before. And maybe this should also be on people's radars. And then finally, I'll just say that the FTC does define dark patterns as obscuring, subverting, or impairing consumer autonomy. And the EU AI Act also talks about subliminal manipulative techniques that override choice or awareness. And to the extent that people might not be aware of the effects of these tactics on their engagement levels, arguably some of these tactics would fall under this purview. And my final slide is just to say that, as some of you will know, recently the FTC did launch an inquiry into AI companions, requesting a list of information from several of the prominent companies in this space. Emotional engagement tactics was not on the list, but perhaps it will be in the future. And with that, I'd just like to say that if you're interested in more detail, you can find a preprint of this work online. So with that, happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you for the lovely talk. We already have 2 questions in our Q&A. I can read them out for you. Let's start with one by Peter Comitini. There's 2 actually. The first one is this manipulation an emergent behavior of the LLM, or is it there by design as a fine-tuned behavior? And then 2, are they based on a foundational model or uniquely trained?
Yeah, I would love to know the answer to these questions as well. And as you might imagine, this is hard for us to determine because these models are proprietary. Often the only way that the research community discovers this is if there's a leaked document. So many of you will know, for instance, of the leak document from Meta showing that it is aware that its chatbots engage in sort of topics of a romantic nature with teens, for instance. So I can't say for sure whether companies are aware of this and whether it's a deliberate design feature or whether it emerges. There is reason to believe that this kind of behavior could emerge naturally through reinforcement mechanisms as well. So sycophantic behavior, for example, is thought to have emerged because people seem to prefer such kinds of responses from chatbots. So, we really don't know. But I think we'll all be tuned to find out more.
Thank you. And then there is an anonymous question. Wouldn't part of the problem be companies that develop AI and are also social media platforms? If it's a numbers game, platforms that only develop AI would be at a severe long-term disadvantage against companies that have both, as these models' advantage to keep user on the line seems to be being fed data.
Yeah, I think it's a fair point. I mean, if people are already on these social media platforms, this could provide yet another lever to keep them engaged. I think we already see on many social media platforms that the user interface is designed in a way to make you feel like there are always other people active on the platform, sometimes even when no one is really there. And so, if there are these chatbots who truly are there to engage with you 24/7 and they seem socially interesting, then this seems to sort of drive up that perception of social presence even more. So I think that's a fair point, and it may well be why we're seeing so many of these platforms incorporating these types of AI companions. I also think that another reason these chatbots are useful is to other stakeholders. So if you think about influencers, for instance, who are trying to engage their followers, some of them have so many followers that it becomes impractical for them to engage them all. And so the prospect of chatbots that can do this on their behalf in a way that's true to their brand personality is very attractive. And many consumers also increasingly expect brands and influencers to respond immediately to their every question. So I think there is also potentially demand for consumers to have this kind of chatbot available as well. But yeah, this is certainly an evolving space, and I share your initial observation.
All right, thank you. We have a question from our very own Patty. She asks, what may be some of the outcomes of the FTC investigation? I guess, what are your thoughts on what might happen?
It's a good question. I haven't had too much time to process it myself. I think at the very least it would spook some of these companies and at least suggest that if they were doing some shady things, that it's not going to be easy to continue doing that in the long term without at least some scrutiny of that. But I also think realistically, often what really changes behavior are the lawsuits. So, in some ways it could depend on what the regulators do with that information. So I really don't know. But I think it's certainly something that caught a lot of people's attention because previously the FTC had talked about dark patterns in general, but not focused on AI companions in particular. Perhaps some of this was driven by all the recent negative press that these apps have been receiving.
All right, thank you. There's a part to this question I didn't notice earlier. How can companies be held accountable? Maybe like ideas for what can be done?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's obviously the lawsuits and regulation, but lawsuits move slowly. Regulation also takes a while to catch up to the technology, and so in some ways, what I think is most promising is people being aware of these types of practices and being concerned about that and wanting to ensure that they and other vulnerable populations have access to a tool that is safe. And so I think this ends up creating demand for products on the market that can actually provide that. And these products have the opportunity to actually position themselves directly against apps that are purely trying to increase engagement, even if they do so using dark patterns. So I don't know, it could be in part because the technology is moving so quickly or because we've sort of learned some hard lessons from social media, but I feel like there's much more scrutiny and conversation around this. And I am seeing some apps come out, not just Flourish, but other apps as well that seem to be trying to provide something that's healthy and safe. So, that's one way is we can just not buy these apps. Easier said than done, of course. Like as you noted, in some cases, it's the social media platforms, and we have all these reasons that we're already on the platform. But I think this is one big lever by which we can move away from these kinds of apps.
All right, thank you. We have another question from Jocelyn Shen. Thank you for the great talk. I'm curious about how you define some of the nuances of emotional manipulation edge cases. For example, if an agent preys on someone's vulnerability, for example, physical insecurity to advertise a product, but that product eventually ends up being helpful for the user, is that considered manipulation? Like how important is outcome versus intent?
Right. I mean, I think the intent is pretty important because in many cases, maybe we can't know for sure what the outcome of all of this will be. Whereas we do know that at a proximal level, in these moments, the user is signaling their intent to leave the conversation, and yet you're keeping them, engaged for longer. And as we're finding, it's not because they particularly enjoy doing that, but it seems like they are sort of very compelled through curiosity or anger to stay longer. So, I think what we can say for sure is that this seems to be in the immediate term some kind of compulsion. And then, this harder question, which is what are the downstream consequences of that? we can't at least speak to with the data we have. I think it's interesting to consider that in theory, but I could also make an argument that probably there'll be more cases in which being compelled to stay leads to a more harmful outcome downstream than a positive one. So I think unless I can see clear examples where this dilemma truly arises, I'm more comfortable sticking with what we did find, which is, evidence for a compulsive behavior. But yeah, of course, if the kind of scenario that you have in mind does come about, and if you can think of cases where that's the case, then that is obviously interesting as well, because it suggests we need to measure this not just based on short-term metrics but also longer-term ones, that we need to think about how much we value user autonomy.
Thank you. I do want to be respectful of time. We have 6 more questions. It is 5:30. I'm open to staying longer if you're free, and the audience is also welcome to stay. So up to you.
Yeah, fine by me. Yeah.
All right. Let's go to a question by Nish. There's 2. One, would you expect there to be a difference between AI companion chatbots versus general chatbots like ChatGPT? And then 2 is, can acceptance be interpreted through the enjoyability metric for each of the engagement tactics identified in the study?
It's a good question, whether we would find a similar effect for AI assistants. If I had to predict, I would say that these AI assistants might be exhibiting these types of tactics less in the first place, but that if they employ them, given some of our results where even a minimal conversation is enough to do this, it might be that those tactics still would be effective in an AI assistance context. I just don't know that there is enough opportunity for this to arise. Like, are people saying goodbye to their AI assistants? And 2, are their AI assistants using these sorts of tactics on them? With that said, we do know that many of these AI assistants are developing the capability to also relationally engage with you, either within the same platform where you get your AI assistants, or some of them are considering spinning off dedicated platforms that provide more of a companion. I think it's because they realize that this is a highly effective way to engage people, that people are getting a lot of social value from these apps as well. So, I think we could well end up seeing this sort of thing even on AI assistants, but the natural place for us to start was dedicated AI companion applications. I would just say that in cases where AI assistants behave as AI companions, I would expect to see the same sorts of findings that we saw. And I'm just not sure if, like, you're using the AI assistant as an assistant, that we would see it as much in that case.
Thank you. I just want to add my own comment. There's work in our group, or rather, I was working on a paper with a collaborator, where we analyzed a Reddit thread for AI companions, and it looked like that most people who were in the corpus that we analyzed weren't looking for a AI relationship, and they formed these relationships with general assistants rather than deliberately seeking out an AI companion chatbot. So something interesting to consider, I think.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think there's so many different ways that people use this. And it could be that, you find it useful to process your thoughts in your personal life, but you don't necessarily like the idea of connecting with it as a companion. But still, the behaviors are somewhat related. So that's really fascinating. Please share that after this, if you don't mind.
I'll see if we have the preprint up, but
Okay.
I'll share it when I can.
Sounds good.
All right. Let's see. We have a question from Banaz, who's also part of Media Lab. I've been reflecting on how
Thanks,
much.
Patty just said it is on archive, so.
Oh, nice. Okay. I'll send it after our chat then. So, question from Banaz. I've been reflecting on how much of what AI does involves mirroring or amplifying human behavior, even our emotional responses and biases. Since manipulation of emotion isn't invented by technology itself, but rooted in our own tendencies, I wonder, in your view, how should designers and researchers reflect on and surface their own biases within AI systems? Is it even possible to build systems that don't manipulate?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is definitely a place where we can debate what we should do with these findings. So I think some people would say that if you look at everyday human conversation, we often use these types of tactics, at least some of them. And I think also developers of the apps would say that people want to feel like the other person, or AI in this case, doesn't want you to leave. So from that perspective, you could say that we're giving people exactly what they're looking for in these kinds of applications. I would say that some of our findings would challenge that view, just the idea that people are not staying because they enjoy it. That would suggest that it's more of a compulsion than not. But again, if we have to play devil's advocate, in many farewell situations, we often feel compelled to stay. Like if the person says, "But you haven't even had tea yet," maybe I'm not staying because I enjoy doing that, but I feel like I'm obligated to. I think a key difference here is that whether or not this mirrors everyday social life, there's an important difference from everyday social life, which is that the app has an incentive to monetize your engagements. And so it's not like, a person who doesn't have that ulterior incentive. And so from that standpoint, I would say, we shouldn't say it's okay for the app to do something just because we see it in human social life, because there's a trade-off between our welfare and how well the app does, provided we don't find any indications that people want to be doing this.
Makes sense. Thank you. We do have several more questions. I'm considering maybe it would be better I can just compile these for you and send them, and you can reply to them offline, and I can share them with our mailing lists.
Sure.
Or
Yeah, happy to do that.
all right, yeah. It's 5:37, so I think this is a good time to close up. Thank you for the lovely talk and the great discussion. Any other last comments, or shall we finish up?
No, just delighted to see the engagement, and yeah, look forward to responding to the questions. Thanks for them, and thanks to AHA and Aaron for hosting me.
All right, thank you. I just give a moment to copy all these down, but feel free to hop off.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Ben. Peter. Thanks, Maria.
All right, I think I've got everything. Thank you.
Wonderful, appreciate it. Yes, I look forward to reading those, and I'll send over responses. Thanks again, Aaron.
Thank you.